Grade 11, Lesson 1 of Databases, Introduction to Relational Databases. Good day all, welcome to the first lesson of Grade 11 Databases. We will be looking at the Introduction to Relational Databases. Let's begin. Contents of this video. We will be defining a relational database. We will then look at the principles of a relational database, specifically data, rows, columns. In columns, we will look at data types and data sizes. We will then look at tables, and lastly, we will look at primary keys. After that, we will look at two examples, specifically the design view and the datasheet view. Let's define a relational database. A relational database is a database that can store, recall, and perform arithmetic operations on data that is related to each other. In other words, the data in the database is related to each other. For example, if we had a database with all the cars in a small town and all the drivers of the cars of the town, each in their own table, then we can say that the data is related to each other, as the diagram below shows. Let's look at the principles of a relational database. Data. Data is defined as follows: a recorded, known fact with implicit meaning. Thus, the fact is valid and has been verified. If unsure of what this means, please see our video on validation versus verification. Let's look at an example. We will look at an example of a pet store database. These are some examples of data in a pet store database. Let's look at rows. Let's define a row. A row is a collection of data. All the data is related to some way to each other in the row. Let's look at an example. Is the following row correct? A pet store with the following: an item ID, an item name, price, weight in kilograms, and quantity left. Is this row correct? Is the data related to each other? Yes, they are. Let's look at another example. Is the following row correct? A pet store database that has item ID, item name, car registration number, favorite TV show, and quantity left. Are all these items in the row related to each other? No, they're not. Let's look at columns. Note, columns is also known as fields. Let's define a column. A column is a category. The data in this category has to conform to the specifications the column was created with. For example, a column by the name date. Correct data for this column is the following. Incorrect data is that. Let's look at some suggested naming conventions of column names. Do not use spaces. Rather use underscore. For example, ID underscore num instead of ID space num. This can be useful to try and stop many errors from coming forth when starting to program with a database. Keep names short but descriptive. For example, ID underscore num instead of identification underscore number. This will save you a lot of time when programming, as the name is short and descriptive, you know what it is about, yet you do not have to type a very big variable name. Lastly, avoid using numbers in column names unless no other option exists. Again, this is to try and avoid unnecessary errors. Let's look at some data types. A column can only have one data type, but different columns can have different data types. Columns can have primitive data types as column data types, and depending on the database management system, the DBMS, other data types can also be included. For examples of data types, you have integer, string, boolean, char, all these primitive data types. Date and time is also an example of data types, but depending on the database management system. Let's look at sizes of columns. The column size can be specified. This can be used to reduce the size of the database. For example, only comes, let's just restart that part. Let's look at the size of columns. The size of the column can be specified. This can only be used to reduce the size of the database. Only comes into effect with very large databases. In small databases, the size does not really matter that much. This can also be used as a validation step to ensure the data is less than or equal to the correct size. Example, the South African ID number is of length 13. Thus, if we set the column size to 13, we can only enter a length of ID less than or equal to 13. Table. Let's look at the definition of table. A table is a collection of rows and columns that are related to each other in some way. We will discuss an example a bit later. Let's look at primary keys. The definition. A primary key is a column that is unique to each row. Remember again, column and field are the same thing. In other words, each row has a unique data for the primary key column. Why is this important? Used to uniquely identify each row in the table. Will be used when relationships are established between tables in the database. This establishment of relationships between tables is beyond the scope of this video. In most database management systems, primary keys are indicated with a lock or a key. Let's look at how all of these principles fit together. We have data. A collection of data is known as a row. A collection of rows is known as a table. And a collection of tables is known as a database. Let's look at an example, specifically the design view example. Pause the video and identify all the principles in the following picture. Let's identify all the principles. We have tables, columns, and data types. We also have the primary key, as indicated by the key. Let's look at another example, specifically the datasheet view. Pause the video and identify all the principles in the following picture. Let's identify all the principles in this picture. We have tables over there, all our columns, our rows. Then we have a single entity as a data. Then we have our primary key or field. And lastly, the references.